Hey guys, Yamakiller here again with another in-depth video, not so much gameplay related in the same way as my regular videos, but something much more in-depth, something I'm working on, something as a follow-up video, follow-up to my 4 Pillars of Modern video. If you haven't watched that video, I'd highly suggest watching it before. I'll have it in the link in a description down below. It is very good at giving you a background idea about what this video is going to be about. And yeah, I put some good time into this. Spent about a week on it. Some people were clamoring for a video on, people knew what the 4 Pillars of Modern. People knew, like, okay, these are the best cards in Modern. People wanted a video on, okay, if we're not playing the best cards of Modern, what do we get to play? What are we going to be playing? What decks are there? What strategies are there? And this is a video talking over that. This is a video describing some of those strategies and talking about Modern as a whole again. And before we get into it, before we start, I would really, really like it if you guys gave the video a like, if you guys gave the video, or I guess the channel, a subscribe. Look in the description below, follow my socials, etc., etc. Kind of the, the call to action before we actually start the content. I do appreciate all of the freebies if you guys can give me them. And with that being said, let us get into it. This video is going to be titled Modern's Tier 2 Death by Fire, and you will see why. Fire is not by a literal fire, but rather F.I.R.E Design. Now, before we get into, how to build our decks that are in the Tier 2, what is necessarily the not necessarily the toppest tier of decks, but rather the thing below it, let's talk about what's Tier 1. Quick overview, Lyris of the Dream Den, one of the best companions, one of the most broken mechanics. You want to be playing this in almost all of your decks if possible. Ragavan, great thing to be using with like Lightning Bolt and Holy Heat and Dragon Rage Channeler, just kind of the package of these red-based mid-rangey controlling decks. You've got, the Cascade mechanic and Shardless Agent for Crashing Footfalls, Living End, these other combo decks that can use it as well, and Urza's Saga, a land that is both value, combo-y, and gets you mana. So these are like what's going to be in the Tier 1. This is what I consider the Tier 1. The upper echelon of cards and decks are going to be involving these strategies or these cards. Now, what makes those cards Tier 1 versus other cards? Consistency and power. Ragavan, incredibly powerful card that comes on to play turn 1 and can take over the game immediately. Lyris creates an incredibly consistent deck, allows you to play into the longer game with a low to the ground strategy. Cascade, incredibly consistent mechanic. You're going to be cascading to the same card. Same with, Urza's Saga is going to be doing the same thing a lot of the time. Difficult to interact with in a way that puts you on top of the interaction. Interacting with Lyris will almost always, at best, give you a 1-for-1. Usually you're not really getting better than that. Urza's Saga is going to be a 3-for-1, hard to interact with because it's a land. You need sideboard cards to interact with these strategies. You need these sideboard cards that are not necessarily going to be better than a 1-for-1 and really cost you in deck building as well, if you are not playing these cards yourself. Mana advantage less card advantage. You get a lot of card advantage out of these cards. You get a lot of mana advantage out of these cards. These are things that, you're looking for in a Tier 1 deck, these strategies that's going to be consistent, powerful. You're going to get advantages over your opponent, and your opponent can't necessarily interact with them well. Now, what makes a deck Tier 2 compared to Tier 1? Not as large of a meta share as Tier 1. Usually Tier 1, rather, it has those elements that I talked about before, but it also, just has a large metagame share. There's like 5 to 10% as it is in Modern. Like 10% of a metagame is pretty high in Modern as a format that used to have lots of diversity, that used to, if a metagame share of a deck got like above 5%, you'd be like, maybe that needs a banning. But now, above 10% sounds about right, The cards are so powerful, that's what it's going to be. In other formats, like in Standard, Tier 1, your decks are going to be 10, 20, 30% because there's not as many cards to be played. Strategies aren't going to be as much. Legacy, the same thing as Modern, same with Vintage. 5, 10% is usually in a very, very good Tier 1 strategy. Now, compared to Tier 2, Tier 2 is going to be less than that. It's going to be like 1 to 3%. It's going to be your metagame choice. It's going to be archetype that's on the come up that hasn't quite shown itself to be Tier 1 yet. Either new cards got printed for it, or it's just a less explored strategy. KCI for a long time was a Tier 2/3 strategy. People were trying to make it work, and then new cards got printed for it and bumped it up to Tier 1. So sometimes it's either missing some sort of card, it hasn't been figured out how to be built necessarily correctly. These are some of the things that can make a tier 2 deck. You know, flaws with a strategy and a metagame choice. A deck like Ad Nauseam in Modern used to be a clear tier 2/tier 3 strategy, never had the metagame share, never had the consistent results for it to be called a tier 1 deck. But in the right metagames, you know, if everyone's playing Burn, you slap down a Phyrexian Unlife, your opponent's going to be pretty dang sad. You know, you find the right metagames for these decks, they're going to be great, they're going to win you a tournament, but they're still going to be considered tier 2 decks a lot of the time. There's also, you know, flaws with the strategy. If you're playing a combo deck, it could be really good in a metagame, but, you know, it has, it's very delicate or it's very fragile. You know, if it can be disrupted easily, if people want to play sideboard cards for it, it's going to drop down. Something like Dredge. You know, if no one's playing Graveyard Hate, your deck's going to be great, but if everyone's packing 4 ley lines and 4 rips, you're not going to really be tier 1 unless, you know, you've got the really, really broken cards of some sort. Now, as I said, Modern used to be a greatly, you know, Modern used to have a very flat power level. You know, the difference between tier 1 and tier 3, you know, tier 3 could beat tier 2 and tier 1 and could win any given tournament. A lot of Modern tournaments did not have more than like 2 copies of any given deck or any given strategy in the top 8. You'd see like a top 8 filled with like TRON, Infect, Burn, Storm, like a blue-white control player, some Kiki Chord, and like some other random decks. You'd see a lot of differing strategies. Very, very rarely would you see a top 8 or a top 32 with more than like 3, 4 of a certain copy. If you saw like 4 or 5 copies in the top 8 or top 32, you'd be like, it's looking bad. But now, you know, as I will show later, it's not quite the same. And the difference between tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 wasn't that large, as I said. But now the difference between tier 1 and tier 2 is very drastically different. There are very clear strategies and cards you're going to be playing in tier 1. Whereas in the past, you know, there wasn't these cards like 2021, 2020, 2019 cards that are all like ubiquitous amongst a bunch of strategies because you kind of want to play the same cards because they're just the best cards. There was a lot of flatness and power level and synergy-based decks and combo decks and all these things could really thrive and, you know, do very well in Magic. And as I'm saying, everything changed when the F.I.R.E Nation attacked. I'm talking about F.I.R.E as F.I.R.E Design that started in War of the Spark. This is an article, you know, came out in July or in June 21st, 2019 from Andrew Brown describing F.I.R.E Design. F.I.R.E Design is, when they described it as F is for fun, I is for inviting, R is for replayable, E is for exciting. Now, this is not quite how I would describe F.I.R.E. Exciting? Not exactly. I guess the first time you play against it. Replayable, you're going to be playing against it a lot. That's for sure. Fun, you know, I don't know how fun it is. Inviting, definitely not inviting to the wallet. Definitely not inviting to new players. So I'm not quite sure what they were meaning by this, because F.I.R.E Design does not quite encapsulate these ideologies. Now, as I said, F.I.R.E Design started in War of the Spark. And we're still in the F.I.R.E Design era. You know, Modern Horizons 2 came out. You see some what we describe as F.I.R.E cards, egregious F.I.R.E Design, you know, Monkey, Luris, etc. Now, these F.I.R.E Design at its peak are, you know, Oko, Hogak, Uro, banned in multiple formats, are just completely dominant metagame cards. You know, these cards that are just really broken. And while we haven't seen, like, during this era of F.I.R.E, we've seen the most amount of bans out of any single, you know, era. You know, 2019, 2020, 2021. Loads and loads of bans in every single format. Standard, Modern, Pioneer, Legacy. Even Vintage has seen loads of restrictions. And it's just a little bit, you know, these F.I.R.E designs getting a little bit ridiculous. This is a spreadsheet I got from Jonathan Zhang, Final Nub, I guess, on Magic Online. He did a spreadsheet looking at a top 32 of a format of a legacy super, or not a legacy, sorry, a modern super PTQ, and was counting the amount of F.I.R.E cards, not just F.I.R.E cards, but egregious F.I.R.E cards. He found in each deck stuff like Force Negation, Ragavan, Luris, you know, Murktide Regent, these cards that just like overpowered the format and really became the best things to be doing very, very quickly and came out of, you know, mostly Modern Horizons 2. As you can see, you know, 35 F.I.R.E cards, 29 F.I.R.E cards, 31 F.I.R.E cards. Very, very few decks. Only one Dredge deck, you know, 0 F.I.R.E cards. There's even, you know, Burn gets some F.I.R.E cards. TRON gets some F.I.R.E cards, etc., etc. Really, a lot of these F.I.R.E cards are dominating the format. But, you know, that's what's happening a lot in the tier 1. But in tier 2, you know, there's also some F.I.R.E. As I say, fight fire with fire. Synergy is good. Good cards are better. Sometimes you want to be synergistic. Sometimes you want to be combo-y. The good cards are usually just going to be better nowadays. But that does not mean the quote-unquote bad cards or the synergistic cards or the combo cards are not going to be good. Because when everyone's trying to fight fire with fire, you can sneak on and come and find your niche and destroy exactly what your opponent's doing. The first iteration of this, the first iteration of the tier 2 decks that I want to talk about here are combo decks. For a long time, Force Negation really shut out combo decks. Those Uro, Sanctuary, Force Negation decks were really shutting out combo decks. Trying to play against 3 Force Negations, counterspells, all these things is very, very hard. So combo decks get to do things now that Force Negation is falling out of favor, because you don't want to 2-for-1 yourself for a Lightning Bolt or an Unholy Heat. You're barely trading up on mana, and you're trading very far down on cards. And combo decks also, a lot of them are built such that the discard that is heavily played in these like Luris, red-black, Grixis decks, you're very redundant against them. A lot of your combo cards are redundant, and you don't really care about 1 or maybe 2 discard spells. And people do not have a fast clock as well. There's no lightning fast infect coming around. It's these decks that are killing you on the margin. They're accruing, as Final Nub, person I talk to a lot, says, accruing value on the margin and taking many, many turns to kill you. You can sculpt the hand that you need to win by turn 5, 6, 7, and really just dismantle your opponent with your combo deck. So let us look into one of the first combo decks that's been doing well recently. Sodek, a combo virtuoso, is playing Goblin Charbelcher. Now, this is a deck that got neutered heavily with the ban of Simian Spirit Guide, but that does not mean that it is dead. This deck can kill as early as turn 2, with Desperate Rituals and Ironcrag Feet. And the thing that this deck does that attacks the metagame, as we've seen it, is fairly resilient to discard. You've got Goblin Charbelcher that you can do quickly. Doesn't get hit by Inquisition, so it really needs Thought Seizes, which is not being played as much as Inquisition. And you have a card like Recross the Past, really just lets you set up your deck. Don't care about discard, because off the top you're going to kill your opponent. So this is a deck that attacks those discard-based strategies that are seeing play a lot with Luris of the Dream Den, and all these decks that are playing pretty slowly. Ragavan is not necessarily the quickest card to kill you, although it creates a lot of advantage. You don't care about the advantage, because you're just killing your opponent on turn 2, 3, whatever, when they are killing you regularly on turn 6 or 7. And lots of people don't have sideboard cards for these strategies. That is a big deal. A lot of combo decks die to the sideboard. But when people are fighting each other on a different axis in the sideboard, they're fighting each other on the axis of the Urza Saga needing Alpine Moons. They're fighting each other on the axis of Ragavan, or these graveyard synergy-based decks with like Murktide Regent, Dragon Rage Channel. They're not attacking you on the axis of Goblin Charbelcher killing you on turn 2. They're not fighting on the axis of Artifact, maybe Artifact removal, but not Artifact stopping, like Stony Silence, these cards that can really hurt you. So really this gets to play a niche of the metagame that when people are not expecting it, you can really take advantage of that. Now there's also these combo decks with what I call combo with a side of value. White-Black Reanimator, you're playing Persist and Unhallowed Grave, but you're also playing a lot of other cards. You're playing possibly Grief plus Ephemerate, you're possibly playing, some Seasoned Pyromancers, you're possibly playing this kind of bad mid-range game compared to the mid-range games with the top decks, but what you do have is a much, much over-the-top ability of them. You don't care about necessarily the value that they're getting from their Luris of the Dream Den. You don't necessarily care about the value that they're getting incrementally on the margin, because you are going much, you're not gaining advantage on the margin, you're gaining advantage on a 1-for-6 or a You're Dead synergy. Heliod Company, most people can't deal with Infinite Life. Black-Green Sacrifice, when you get a Yawgmoth down, I'm going to clear your board and draw 6 cards. Okay, deal with that. And, putting out a Archon of Cruelties on turn 3, not only hard to kill, but it's going to, 3-for-1 your opponent just off the bat, make them sacrifice a creature, discard a card, you get to draw a card. These are strategies that when opponents don't have the correct sideboard cards or the main deck configuration to be able to interact with you, you really get to attack them. As the sideboards are strained a little bit in this ways, you can figure out what sideboards are strained for, what they're not playing, and make your zig when you're supposed to zig and hit them with the right combo deck. But this has the same, downside of, if you zig when you're supposed to zag, and your opponent's playing, 4 Rest in Peace in their sideboard, and you're playing White-Black Reanimator, you're going to be looking very, very foolish. So, as I said, it's a very, very big choice in the metagame call, not necessarily in the power level of the deck. Although the power level is there, you need to have the right metagame to make sure you're doing it. As I'm saying, some of the problems with combos, lots of moving pieces, usually bad by themselves. Young Wolf out of the the black-green deck. Young Wolf, pretty low power level card, but in the context of your opponent playing a Ragavan, or in the context of you sacrificing it twice to a Yawgmoth, going to be very powerful, but by themselves, not very powerful. In the form of Charbelcher, the fragile the house of cards crumbles quickly. Sometimes you just have to mulligan a lot. You just don't have your combo cards, your 8 cards that can actually combo, and you just can't really do anything. In certain sideboard cards, you scoop them up. Can't really deal with that one. So it's not necessarily a freebie just because your combo is good against them. If they have the right sideboard cards, they can really get you. And sometimes your combo doesn't matter. Like if you are playing Heliod and you gain infinite life, sometimes your opponent says, okay, I'm going to play Emrakul, or I'm going to kill you with a Jace the Mind Sculptor ultimate, or some other way that they kind of sidestep your combo and don't care about it. So you got to make sure your combo actually matters in the metagame. So this is why some of the problems arise. Some of the tier 2 aspects, tier 2 aspects really shine out in the deck. It makes you think, okay, I'm not just going to de facto play this deck. I have to think about how the metagame is evolving around it. Whereas, you're going to be de facto playing Lurrus in your Lurrus decks. That's the way it is. That's why they're tier 1 and this is tier 2. Now let's look at another facet of tier 2, control decks. Now control decks are not necessarily looking as they did in the past. They're not, like Cryptic Commands, Archmage's Charms, all these things, and then playing Path to Exiles and Ops and things. They're changing their decks. They're changing more to a Chalice of the Void control deck, because Chalice of the Void never looked so good when everyone's going low to the ground. You can do two things. You can go low to the ground with them and try to kill them before they can, get you, or you can play Chalice of the Void and go really over the top. So you get to play Chalice of the Void, deal with, Lurrus, you get to deal with Ragavan, you get to deal with, these discard spells, these lightning bolt type effects, and you don't really care about the removal spells. You're playing control. What are they going to remove your Snapcaster Mage? You've already 2-for-1 them. Are they going to remove your Solitude? You already 2-for-1 them. So it's pretty hard for them to, get an advantageous spot against you, especially when half their cards are shut off because of Chalice of the Void. And, sometimes your opponent is playing a combo deck, another tier 2 strategy, and counter spells are usually pretty good against those decks as well. But, sometimes you get into a spot where you're like, okay, I've got Chalice of the Void, half your spells are turned off. There's about a couple spells that deal with my Chalice, or a couple spells that can interact with me in any meaningful way. I have Counterspell, I have Archmage's Charm, deal with it. Like, you're not going to be able to deal with it. I've got Counterspells. I've got backup. Now, this is a deck list by McWinsauce. This was originally, crafted to an extent by Watto, which is Guillaume Wafo-Tapa, along with some other players. And it's basically Chalice of the Void control. You get to play Counterspells. You get to play some Archmage's Charm. You play these Planeswalkers that are not going to be as... that are not going to be dealt with in the same way that they were in the past by something like Unholy Heat, which really made Planeswalkers really hard to play because they were going to be dealt with by a 1-mana spell. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria in the face of Unholy Heat looks really, really bad on a mana advantage scale, especially when you're trying to go over the top. But when you add Chalice of the Void, these 1-drops you don't care about. And you get to play Prismatic Ending, which gives you a 1-mana removal spell that scales into the late game and can be played when Chalice of the Void is in play. So really, you get a lot of different stuff here by getting to play Chalice of the Void, which is really, really good in the metagame, both for, these Lurrus decks that are playing mainly 1-drops, as well as the Cascade decks that you just Chalice for 0, your Cascades don't work anymore. And when you're playing counterspells to back it up, it really, really hurts the ability of your opponent to deal with what you're doing. There's other takes as well. You don't necessarily need to play Chalice of the Void. Maybe you were going to just play Murktide Regent, which is incredibly hard to kill with the 1-mana removal spells, because even though Unholy Heat deals 6 damage, it doesn't deal 8 damage that you're going to make your Murktide Regent into. You get to play a removal suite that is low to the ground with these lightning bolts, prismatic endings, but you get to go a little bit more over the top and gain a little bit more value. Even though you're not playing a card like Lurrus of the Dream Den, you're playing slightly more over the top and you're realizing, okay, I'm not going to play these 1-drops because everyone's going to be training infinite removal spells. So what can I play to get a little bit more advantage than that? I'm going to play these Snapcaster Mages that maybe I'm going to have to invest a bit more mana into, but if I can get the game to a point where I can invest more mana, then I'm going to be coming out on top in these exchanges. So you have to think about, how can I leverage mana? How can I leverage my opponent's deck building to make my control deck work? But once again, a big problem with control. Oh, sorry. There we go. Or I guess before we talk about some of the problems with control, let's talk about this other control deck that is Indomitable Creativity, a deck that I've played a lot in the past and has gone through some iterations. It basically adds a control element with, these lightning bolts, prismatic endings, Fire, Ice, Prismatic Command, and Planeswalkers, and then adds a combo element where you're not trying to kill them slowly with a Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, or a Solitude, but rather a combo element with Indomitable Creativity into Velomachus Lorehold plus Emrakul. You use your Velomachus to hit a Time Warp and then kill your opponent the next turn. Really, it's adding the ability to both end the game quickly as well as play a long, drawn-out controlling game, and you have the looming threat of combo over your opponent's head, making them possibly play mana inefficiently or sideboarding in an inefficient way when you can sideboard some good answers to them. So, this is another way to build control with combo, but also has some long-lasting effects that, has problems with it. So, some problems with control is, if you look at these decks, your hand could just be like, okay, I've got 2 Archmage's Charms, I've got 2 counter spells, and my opponent has a creature in play and I cannot deal with it. Or, okay, I've got some counter spells, my opponent put a creature into play on turn 1. Or, I've got these removal spells, my opponent played a Planeswalker and I don't have a way to deal with the Planeswalker, and now they're going to gain so much advantage that I can't come back with it because I have to leave this mana up for these counter spells, can't use my mana to deal with the Planeswalker or else another threat's going to come down. And sometimes, as that comes with it, sometimes your opponent poses you, okay, do you have my answer to the Ragavan? And you're like, I have Force Negation. Your opponent goes, Goblin Charbelcher, I have Prismatic Ending in hand. That doesn't work. And sometimes your answers don't line up to the threats that your opponent makes you answer. You don't get to quite line up correctly. And it can lead to you just not being able to interact with your opponent in a meaningful way and dying very, very quickly. Some hands with control, you open them up and you're like, okay, if my opponent's playing Burn, I cannot win. Or you open up, it's like, my opponent's playing Tron, I cannot win. There are just certain times where your opening hand goes like, okay, against these, this hand's going to be very good against these decks, very bad against these decks. It's a clunker against these, and hopefully I'm right about what my opponent's doing. Sometimes you're wrong, and it just gets the best of you. Or sometimes, you keep a hand that's like, I've got a Prismatic Ending as my removal spell, and some 3s and 4s, and hopefully my Prismatic Ending bridges the gap between the other cards in my hand. And when it doesn't, your hand gets clunky and you get steamrolled over, and it's just really, really hard to make work. So these are some of the problems with control, but when you hit them with a Prismatic Ending your Ragavan on turn 1 into a Chalice of the Void into leave up a counterspell, you're looking very, very pretty against a large portion of the strategies. So this is something to think about when you're playing control or how you're constructing your control deck. As I'm saying repeatedly with these tier 2 decks, you need to make sure that you're finding a niche in the metagame and exploiting it. Now this is another thing that you can be doing in the metagame. It always comes back to Tron. Tron, I don't know how long it's been around, 10, 11 years in Modern, like infinite time Tron's been around. And every time people think Tron is dead, Tron comes back from the grave. It finds its way back. People stop playing land destruction. People stop interacting with lands, or they have slow clocks, or they, all of the above. And you're just like, okay, Urza's Mine Expedition map. Go get turn 3 Tron Karn. Oh, you can't deal with it? Scoop them up. Oh, Wormcoil Engine. Your deck can't deal with the Wormcoil Engine? Scoop them up. This happens a lot more often than you think. Metagames get to the point where your opponents are playing, controlling decks or mid-range decks that take a while to kill your opponent. Even if they got the right sideboard cards, you're getting to turn 5, 6, 7 as Tron. Sometimes you just hit your land drops, play a Wormcoil Engine, scoop them up. And that's kind of how Tron can be sometimes. So if the metagame gets to the point where that can happen, Tron can always be a great, great decision. But, as many people like to say, they don't really like playing with or against Tron. So, if you're willing to sell your soul to the old Karn father, this could be another great decision for a tier 2 deck. If Karn Liberated ain't your cup of tea, but you're willing to play a turn 3 Matter Reshaper, Eldrazi Tron's here for you, it does play Urza Saga, so, it's playing one of those tier 1 cards, but it's not to the same extent as a deck like Hammer Time. Not to the same extent as a deck like, Jund Saga, these decks that are really leaning into it. This is more of you got to play Urza Saga. You don't really have a package for it, but you got to play it, and it's a nice little addition. This deck is mainly leaning on the fact that Chalice of the Void is good in the metagame right now, and you get to play sometimes. Sometimes you got to go turn 3 Tron, Thought-Knot Seer Reality Smasher, or Thought-Knot Seer Matter Shaper, or Walking Bliss for 3, shoot down your board, or Karn the Great Creator, I win the game. So this preys on the fact that you get to have these high roll hands, as well as, Chalice of the Void just high rolling your opponent and them not being able to cast their spells. But, as with problems with every deck in this list of tier 2 decks, Tron has its own unique situations where it's not great. It does mulligan well, you know. Sometimes you just turn 3 Tron on a mulligan to 3 and kill your opponent. But it mulls very often. If you're not liking to mulligan to 6, 5, 4, 3, sometimes even 2 with Tron, it's not the deck for you. You gotta stomach those mulligans, you gotta stomach those games, and that's just the way the deck is. And your payoff doesn't always matter. Sometimes you keep, you know, I've got a 6-card hand that's 5 lands. They're like Tron or pieces to find Tron plus a Karn the Great Creator, and it just doesn't work out for you. It's the Karn the Great Creator doesn't matter, Karn Liberty doesn't matter, your whatever payoff just doesn't matter in the end. And then you can just draw kind of like ways to find Tron or cantrips that don't really do anything. So there is that fact that even though your deck can be good, you know, it does have this fail rate of kind of a combo deck in the same way. It looks like a ramp deck, or it looks like, you know, a Tron deck per se, but it kind of plays out like a combo deck in a lot of the games. So let's look over, why are we playing a tier 2? Why are we not playing these tier 1 decks? Why are we playing tier 2? You want to abuse a non-diverse metagame. If the metagame is not diverse and it's very pinpointed on a certain strategy or a certain grouping of cards, you can abuse that. You can say, okay, what grouping of cards, while it is, you know, narrow, do beat this deck? You know, we're going to have a lot of bad matchups, but if we have a great matchup against this deck or these strategy or these cards that are played a lot, we're going to have an advantage on our opponents. We're going to have an advantage that we can use that they're not going to expect and not going to be prepared for. And that's something that you can really use to, you know, win any given tournament, and people do it all the time. And, you know something that the Hive Mind doesn't. As I said previously, there are certain tier 2 decks that will become tier 1 the more that you iterate on them, the more that there's going to be cards printed for them. If you are iterating on a strategy that you believe will be tier 1 once you get it down, put some more time into it, you know, go into a tournament with it that's not necessarily as good as it could be, but you learn something about it. You know, that's a reason to play a tier 2 deck. It's a reason to gain knowledge and to possibly iterate on something that could be one of the best decks. As I said in the past, a great example of that was KCI, a deck that just people were iterating on, and then finally the card came and finally the configuration came where people put it all together and was able to, you know, make a tier 0 deck that, you know, eventually got banned. And a final reason, let's be honest here, we mostly play Magic because we enjoy playing Magic. If you don't enjoy the deck that you're playing, there's not much reason to play. So make sure you enjoy your deck, whether that be tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier a million. If you don't enjoy the deck you're playing, I would highly suggest trying to find a deck, even if it's not necessarily the most competitive. If it has a chance to win in some tournament environment, you enjoy playing it, you know, that's more than enough for a lot of people. So with all that being said, I hope you guys figured out, you know, what to do if you are not wanting to play those top tier decks. I've given you some strategies, some ideas to work on, some ideas and strategies to think about, and card choices and potentially, other things to work on with those in the way. And I hope you guys enjoyed the video as well. It was a bit shorter and it wasn't necessarily as focused as the 4 pillars. I'm trying to figure out some other ideas. I worked on that other video, you know, obviously for many, many months. This is more of a week process, and I think I did a pretty good job about getting my ideas across and the ideas across about what a tier 2 deck is in Modern in the current landscape and some of the things you can be doing. I didn't go over everything that could have been tier 2, you know, I didn't go over these like mid-range decks that are kind of in the tier 3, tier 4 because they're kind of not necessarily strategies that are different. They're not like, you know, they're not the combo deck, they're not the control deck. They're just strategies that are kind of playing inferior cards for no meaningful purpose. You know, you can make an argument that, oh, you know, I could play these cards, and they're so much better than their Lurrus counterpart. And let's be honest here, we're not going to trick ourselves. I know that there's a reason that these tier 1 cards are being played and not some other variation of the strategy. But these tier 2 decks, you know, they do have their place. They do well, you know, they do reasonably well. They're in top 8s, they're in top 32s. But they're not to the same extent as tier 1. But if you don't enjoy those tier 1s, these are the tier 2 decks that you can play, the tier 2 decks, strategies that are different and appeal to those other decks. But yeah, I hope you guys really enjoyed the video. Hope you guys enjoyed these topics. I will come up with something else to talk about next week. Hopefully something enjoyable for you guys and something that I can continue to iterate on these video series and be good and something that you guys really enjoy watching and enjoy consuming and I enjoy making. And if you enjoyed all this, make sure to give me a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me on my socials down below, and everything in between. Thank you guys for watching the video. I appreciate it a lot, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye-bye.